All right, well, it looks like it is 12, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kayla Clark, and I will be your moderator today. And I coordinate public programs for UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. So as an organization, we contribute to healthy coastal ecosystems and communities through research, education, and extension. So I'm really excited that you're going to get to talk to Keren Giovengo today, who is the EcoScapes Sustainable Land Use Program Manager. But before we do, I want to share just a few Zoom logistics. Please use the Q&A box if you have questions, and you can ask questions at any point during the program. I definitely encourage you to write them while you're still thinking of them, but we're going to hold those questions until the end, and then we'll have a Q&A period. We might have some questions for you, and we'll add those in the chat box, and you can respond there. Like I just saw that someone joined us from Skidaway and that they saw a pileated woodpecker, so that's exciting. Those are always cool to see, and you can keep adding things to the chat box throughout. But your audio and your video will stay out or stay off during the program. We are recording and we'll post to YouTube, usually within about a week after the live program. Keren is also going to share a PDF of the PowerPoint, so don't feel like you have to take notes during the whole thing. And we're also curious about who is in the audience, so we're going to start with a few polls. It does look like we also had folks join from St. Simon's Island and saw bald eagles, which is always exciting as well. So I'm going to launch a poll, and you should see a green box appear on your screen. And I'm curious how many of you currently birdwatch. And we'll give it about 10 more seconds.
Great.
Awesome. So it looks like 26 of you, or 93%, currently birdwatch. So that's awesome. And I'm also curious, since this one is also about plants, how many of you currently garden? Whether it's at home or work, any kind of gardening. Awesome. I'm seeing results coming in. I'll give it just a few more seconds. Wonderful. So it looks like 27 of you currently garden. And then how many of you currently use native plants in your landscape? And if you do have native plants, did you select them for the purpose of attracting or supporting birds in your landscape?
Wow.
About 10 seconds left. This is awesome. You all are some of the quickest poll responders that I've had. Wonderful. So you can see that 27 of you currently use native plants in your landscape. And actually a lot of you did pick them for supporting birds. So it's super interesting. And we're definitely going to learn some more about why that's awesome that you're already doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll results. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Keren.
Well, thank you all for taking time out of your lunch today to share it with Kayla and I. I've been asked to speak to you regarding bird-friendly native landscapes for coastal Georgia, and seems like I'm talking to quite a seasoned audience here. It's wonderful, and I'm amidst people that absolutely adore and love birds. Firstly, I just wanted to give you a moment to tell you about EcoScapes program. EcoScapes is all about engaging Georgians in becoming better stewards of our natural resources. And Kayla mentioned that we do this in our organization through research support, technical advisory, education, and technical assistance. And I will be providing you all a sheet that provides some of the EcoScape resources that I thought might be helpful and pertain to the subject matter today. I'll be discussing our EcoScapes native plant search engine, but we also have a guidance document on our website that can provide step-by-step advice to how to utilize that search engine. And we also have some guidance documents such as how to shop and garden for native plants, how you should consider how to go about with natives and where are nurseries that are available to provide you those plants. We have a guidance series on pollinators, different ones as well as wildlife, and a checklist on different practices, both large and small, that you can consider in your landscape to help reduce or eliminate your chemical use. And I also want to bring up a brand new program for our organization. My colleague, Jess Brown, our stormwater engineer, and myself, we are creating a Rain Gardens in Coastal Georgia program. And you see a cover, the picture is a cover of a new handbook that will very soon be available to residents in coastal Georgians. And our first webinar to basically inaugurate the program is going to be on Saturday, March 13th from 10 a.m. to noon. And if you're interested in more information, please contact Kayla. And I also want to mention before I dived in, there's some wonderful gardening for bird books out there. And I just wanted to share with you two that I find very beneficial for myself. And there are others, but just recommend these if you want to seek out any more comprehensive information on birding for landscaping for birds. So I'm going to be speaking on quite a bit today. Seems like I have an audience that's very knowledgeable, and I hope this will be helpful to you. Now, first part, I'm going to really be starting with the big picture of ecosystems and what's the role of birds and insects and native plants and their interplay and interrelationship in those healthy ecosystems. And then what are some of the challenges for birds and insects and native plants? And there's a call for action. In part two, I'm going to go through quickly some of the basics of how you assess your site to create a bird-friendly landscape, how to select the right native plants for the site conditions that exist in your landscape, and something that's very near and dear to me, natural pest control. Utilizing beneficial insects, attracting them to your landscape to provide natural pest control that will reduce and eliminate chemical use. And part three, I'll be flying through it, but I just wanted to share some examples of native bird-friendly plants for coastal Georgia. So here we go. Healthy ecosystems. Well, what are they? Well, they're ecosystems that consist of both native plant and animal populations. And these plants and animals are interacting in balance with one another and other non-living things, such as water. And we are so blessed in coastal Georgia. We are made up of a vast array of habitats that support these rich and diverse plant and animal communities. Why are ecosystems important? Well, the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment determined that, quote, ecosystems are critical to human well-being, to our health, our prosperity, our security, and to our social and cultural identity. So they're a big deal. And there's some real key indicator of ecosystems, and that is biodiversity. You know, when we think about it, we as people are obtaining benefits of ecosystems from the diversity of life around us. And so the more diverse that life is in that ecosystem, the more services it's going to provide us. And what are some of those ecosystem services? Well, if you think about, we need clean water, and we need food, and we need pollination to provide for the foods that we feed on. We need habitat that provides us and other living things, sources that sustain our lives, etc. So when we think about these ecosystems, the key issue for them is plants, in particular native plants. When you think about it, all energy on Earth is captured by plants. And then all the animals get their food from the plants, whether it's directly or indirectly. And so How much vegetation, how many plants are in an area will determine how much life is supported there. Does that make sense? And then there's these interrelationships of native plants and insects. Insects are key in healthy ecosystems as well. They're the most important group of animals. They're the ones that are transferring energy that's been captured by the plants to the other animals. And since we're talking about birds today, they're very, very important for bird survivability and reproduction. Now, an insect providing that critical food source for roughly 96% of our terrestrial bird young is going to play a key role in how we approach our landscaping today. So we want to embrace insect diversity in our landscapes, and that will provide a balance and role for our healthy landscapes. Now there's even more of an interrelationship. Insects and native plants. 90% of all native insects that eat plants need the native plants they evolved with to complete their development. So we have some insects that have adopted to a very specific family of plants that may occur only within that insect's native range. You might want to think about, for instance, this plant here, beautiful vine, Passiflora incarnata. And here is a Gulf fritillary. It's one of several lepidopterans, butterflies, that depend on Passiflora as a host plant for their young. They do not do well if there are no Passiflora vines in the area. And they are limited in their production and survivability without those particular native plants. Now, when you have a diversity of native plants, you get a diversity of animals. So when you're thinking about insect diversity, you're seeing it increase when you're increasing native plant diversity in a landscape. And all that is further going to support birds and other wildlife. So you're starting to get that interrelationship and balance ideal of healthy ecosystems. That's what we're striving for in our own landscapes. So ultimately, this diversity of native plants is supporting a functioning, healthy ecosystems. By using those native plants, we are helping to preserve the beauty and the balance of those ecosystems. Okay, so let's switch to birds. How are birds doing? Well, there are going to be several reports, scientific documents that I'm going to mention to you today. First of all, in 2018, there was a large global-wide report, an assessment done on many hundreds of existing scientific journal articles. And if you look at this diagram here, you'll see the birds' habitat loss is a major threat to all of these vertebrate species and groups. However, you will see that birds are highly impacted by habitat degradation, followed by exploitation, poaching, etc., followed by introduction of invasive species and disease, then pollution, and then climate change. So today we're going to be concentrating on habitat degradation, pollution, and invasive species, and how we can tackle those. Now in 2019, there was another large comprehensive scientific study that came out specifically to address how birds are doing in North America, in the United States and Canada. And look at this. 2.9 billion birds have been depleted, have disappeared in 50 years since 1970. That's a good decline of almost 30%. And roughly it means that more than 1 in 4 birds have disappeared in the last 50 years. And when I was reading this article, something that really hit home to me was that, first of all, in North America, these declines of birds is occurring in every biome. So for us, we might be looking at the eastern forest birds or the shore birds or the grassland birds. Look at those significant declines. And then interesting enough, and sadly enough, they found that many of the species that we see every day is representing the greatest losses of bird life. So I, having been a formerly an endangered species biologist, was starting to assume, oh my goodness, you know, the loss of these endangered and threatened species. But more I read of this article, this research, they stated that this declines are restricted to not only rare and threatened species. In fact, more than 90% of them came from what we consider common and widespread, quote unquote. And in particular, there were like 12 families that we see in our landscapes all the time that were the most impacted. And they said, hey, let's wake up, people. We've got a call to action. They said, quote, these results have major implications for ecosystem integrity, the conservation of wildlife more broadly, and the protection of birds and native ecosystems upon which they depend. Our results signal an urgent need to address the ongoing threats of habitat loss, to avert continued biodiversity loss and potential collapse of the continental avifauna. Oof. Okay, let's check on how the insects are doing. There was another worldwide global assessment scientific review that was released back in 2019 that determined that, quote, biodiversity of insects is threatened worldwide. Here we go. They determined that there were dramatic rates of decline in diversity and abundance that may lead to the extinction of 40% of the world's insect species over the next few decades. In fact, they felt that the rate of extinction was much faster than that of the mammals and the birds and the reptiles we saw before. And just to give you an idea, when you're thinking about, oh, pollinators, how we love our pollinators, and what are some of these insects that are benefiting our landscapes, although some of these other insects play very important roles in their aquatic or other ecosystems. Look at the butterflies, look at the beetles, look at the bees, and look at the flies. Look how much they have declined in the past decade. And so the insect declines are similar to what we saw with the bird declines of habitat loss, degradation, pesticide use, climate change and extreme weather, invasive species, disease, as well as non-native ornamental plants. Are you seeing a pattern here? And they said, wake up. Here's a call for change. They said a rethinking of current practices, in particular, a serious reduction in pesticide use and its substation with more sustainable, ecologically based practices is urgently needed to slow or reverse current trends, allow the recovery of declining insect populations, and safeguard the vital ecosystem services they provide. So with ever-growing human populations, we're asking for more ecosystem services. But with the impacts we're causing, we are reducing the biodiversity and we're getting fewer and fewer services from those ecosystems. That includes invasive species. That includes pesticides. For example, in 2013, I guess one of the first and largest native bee poisonings occurred in Oregon. Roughly 50,000 bumblebees died after a neonicotinoid had been sprayed on linden trees roughly 3.5 weeks prior to at a Target parking lot. This is happening throughout the United States. And regretfully, all of this habitat loss, fragmentation, these invasive species, pollution, they're all taking a toll on biodiversity. So here's our call for action. We must raise the bar for what we're asking our landscapes to do. Just take a moment to look at these two examples of homes and ask yourself, what biodiversity do I see there? What kind of ecosystem services do I think those landscapes can provide for all living being well-being? We can make a difference. This is big. This is really big, you all. You know, Dr. Doug Tallamy, probably you all have read his first book, Bringing Nature Home, or perhaps his new second one, but he nailed it. He said, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. It is now within the power of individual gardeners to do something that we all dream of doing, to make a difference. In this case, the difference will be to the future of biodiversity, to the native plants and animals in North America, and the ecosystems that sustain them. Woo! Are you all charged now? I sure am. So think about it. Native landscapes, they can change the world. One of my friends and colleagues, Benjamin Voigt, said in his book, our world is asking for landscapes to be more, to light the way to a new relationship with nature. So we can design, we can enhance our landscapes so they become healthy, functioning, and resilient parts of our local coastal ecosystems. And we can have landscapes that mimic some of the disappearing habitats around us and provide that food and shelter and nesting areas for pollinators, for songbirds, for beneficials, and other wildlife. And while doing that, we can improve water quality, conserve water, and truly enhance our coastal community sense of place and beauty and vitality. So the first thing we need to know when we're thinking about our landscapes is you got to know where you live relative to ecoregions. Now we live, if you see this map, we live in the southern coastal plain. And by being in that ecoregion, we kind of have an indication, a baseline of what the kind of plants and plant communities that occur here, and some basic information about our climate, our amount of rainfall, our soils, and complex biological relationships. Now, this is a little bit different than what you might be familiar with as USDA hardness zone maps, which basically provide annual average minimum winter temperatures. Those maps are more appropriate for ornamentals. Your native plant map key is your ecoregion. Next thing you want to do is get outside, read your landscape. That's how I like to say it. You want to look at your site conditions. You know, what's the sunlight and moisture conditions? Do you have any salt exposure issues? How about wind? Any of those microhabitat conditions, take note of those. Write them down if you want. Draw a map if you want. And then look at what existing vegetation you have. Native, non-native, invasive. So when you see that, depending on if you're like adjacent to or leading right into a more natural area, it might help determine what kind of plant communities may do best there in your landscape. Now, if you have any invasive plants, you want to make sure you remove them. And when you remove them, we have lots of wonderful native plants that provide wonderful replacements for those invasives. And I like to use the example of Chinese tallow. Hopefully you don't have any Chinese tallow on your landscape, but if you do, please remove it. But let's say you did plant it at some point in time. They are beautiful plants. Maybe perhaps you liked the leaf, or maybe perhaps you liked the fruit. Well, if you like the leaf, think about planting an eastern redbud instead, or planting swamp tai-tai. And by doing that, you're reducing the capacity of invasives to impact our environment. Next thing, identify any native plant communities that are adjacent to your site. I was saying, I hope perhaps you all may be lucky enough to be adjacent to some of these sites, By doing that, you can get a sense of some of the similar species that may occur there that you may want to apply to your site. And if you are doing such, there's a wonderful book called The Natural Communities of Georgia. It was published in 1999. And the book covers all the different communities of Georgia. So you can look at our ecoregion and find descriptions of specific natural communities and characteristic native plants that make up those communities. And that resource may be very helpful for you. So if you want to, you can write it down. Perhaps you can draw a map. Just sketch an easy map, whatever works for you. And start thinking about, okay, here's the house, here's the beds, here's the turf. You know, what do I like about my existing landscape? What do I not like about it? What do I really want to change? What are some of the challenges? And then look at your landscape for what I call habitat layers. It's that structural diversity that you're really trying to emanate as if in nature. So you're looking at, okay, do I have any large canopy trees? Do I have any shrubs? Do I have any small trees? Or do I have just a lot of herbaceous plants perhaps? These are things that you want to think about when you start thinking about bird-friendly landscapes. You want to consider that the birds may use different components of those canopies, the understory, midstory, and the top canopy for their well-being. And so in a very general manner, you're kind of trying to look at several things. You're looking at the native plants and the diversity of the plant habits, which make up grasses and wildflowers, shrubs, vines, trees, etc. You also want to consider water, and you also want to consider providing dead or dying trees if possible. And I'll talk about these all later in more detail. So I just want to give you several examples of how some folks have implemented this vertical structure, this ideal of canopy into their landscapes. As you can see, there are many, many different ways to address this in your personal landscape. I also want to emphasize when we're talking about birds and when we're talking about insects, trees are a big deal. They are really key. If you're in a small landscape and that is not possible, that is all right. But if you're in a landscape and you have the room for trees and their mature size, please consider it because they really support a greater diversity of insects and ultimately birds than herbaceous plants. So I'm going to go through a couple questions here, additional questions to kind of point out now while you're thinking about, okay, plants, okay, my landscape, what do I want to do for the birds? First of all, look at your landscape. Number one, are there places for birds to hide? Whether you have a cat or you have neighbors that have cats, the ideal feral or residence cats has the largest human caused mortality to birds. We want to keep those cats inside. So consider that first and foremost. Next, are there places for the birds to nest? And often we think of nesting directly in trees. Here's an example in actual Virginia creeper vine, but we also want to consider what do we have available for the wood nesting cavity birds. This is really important because we have roughly 40 bird species in North America that depend on woodpeckers and their carpentry and the cavities that they make for their own rest and roost cavities. You know, we have these secondary birds that are also cavity nesters, but they depend on abandoned holes for their nests. So keep that in mind. Next question, are there sheltered areas where birds can protect themselves from the elements? So down here in coastal Georgia, we typically think of cold and wind and rain throughout the seasons, the growing season as well as the fall and winter. So, do you have some evergreens that provide that shelter in the cold time? Do you have deciduous trees that provide shelter from the rain? Do you perhaps have any piles of stems and leaves in the back that provide further coverage for them? Is there food? Now, food for birds is somewhat complex. We have many different birds that feed in different ways. We have birds that depend on insects for all of their life. And as we discussed, we have young birds, terrestrial birds, that depend on insects for their well-being to survive into adulthood. We have birds that love fruit and nuts. We have birds that depend on seeds, whether they're during the growing season or in the wintertime or during migration. And we have birds that depend on nectar. A real key thing is there water? If you don't have a lot of money, or you don't have the ability to have large beds in your landscape and you want to have birds, make sure you have water available. That will draw so many birds. I had a huge red-tailed hawk sitting on our bird bath just yesterday, and I thought I just really got a kick out of these barred owls that were hanging out on a bird bath in Florida. Diversity of birds need the water. And I also want to provide just an example for hummingbirds. Of course, they can drink water of a bird bath, but what they really love are misters. And if any of you are considering that, you're looking forward to wonderful entertainment by these beautiful birds. Next up, you want to figure out what your native plants that you want that are going to be appropriate for your site conditions. So how do you do that? How do you select the appropriate native plants for your landscape? It's really important that you're picking the right plant for your right site conditions. I wanted to emphasize that because it's key to make sure that you have a healthy, well-survived landscape. So for instance, I'll go back, hold on. Let's say you saw someone, a friend of yours, that had beautiful red flowering plants. You knew they were natives, and boy, the hummingbirds are going after them. You said, well, they were red. I know they were red. Well, we down here in coastal Georgia are lucky enough to have 2 different native plant species that do that job. However, they're both best in different site conditions. For instance, the cardinal flower does well and is really best in moist to wet conditions, can even handle shade. If you're in more drier, full sun site, Salvia coccinea is the best bet, although it can also handle some shade as well. But it just provides an example of how you want to look at the plants you're purchasing for your site. And you want to focus on plants that are providing food for birds throughout the year. You want to think about the type of food that we just discussed, those bugs, fruits, nuts, seeds, and nectar. And you really want to shoot for diversity of those plant habits as much as you can, the trees, the shrubs, the grasses, the vines, the ground cover. So one of the ways you can determine what plants you want is through the EcoScapes native plant search engine, which is based on what county you're in, your site conditions, and the choices you select. And once you make these choices, you hit submit and you'll get a list like this. And you might say, well, gee, I don't know what that means. What do these different species look like? You can select individual species at a time, and you'll then be taken to another page which gives you a lot more detail about that species. Now that's one option. Another option as well is the wonderful Audubon Society Data Plants database for the United States. And you submit your zip code and it will provide you a list of plants for the area. Now I do want to mention that the native plant list I have in the ecosystems database is for landscape available plants. Audubon provides a list of plants, including ones that are not available at a nursery. You want to choose diversity in the color, in the floral shapes, in the bloom time throughout the seasons. And you want to plant flowers in groups. You know, you want to allow that energy source of those insects or of those birds to be preserved as much as possible with this energy demanding search for food. So try to group individual species together, at least 3 to 5 to 7 individual plants per species. And another thing is you really want to concentrate on selecting plants that provide early spring as well as late fall foods for these animals. And boy, oh boy, mature size is really imperative when you're selecting your plants. Hopefully you won't have a condition like this, but you want to seek out mature size, height, and width to make sure that that particular plant is appropriate in your landscape size. And because we're talking about wildlife, when you're selecting native plants for your landscape, I strongly suggest you avoid any hybrids that are not naturally occurring and cultivars for many different reasons, for the well-being of pollinators, beneficial insects, or for birds themselves. Cultivars sometimes are often selected for enhancement, such as berry size, or such as what you'll see, these double bloomed echinacea, purpureas. They are beautiful and they're appropriate in a landscape if you're not concerned about attracting wildlife. But please try to stick to the pure species to provide the best services for the plant that these wildlife evolved with. Another option is to reduce turf lawn. You try to figure out when you're doing that landscape site assessment where you can squeeze some of that turf lawn out and add native landscapes. So you might want to think about up in the top left corner, you might have some large trees. You might want to think about some native ground cover instead of turf. Or on the right top, you might just want to try to expand out closer to that marsh buffer or closer out to buffer an existing tree line with native plants versus the turf. And when you are thinking about maintenance on landscapes with native plants, I surely can tell you that native plant landscapes, they're wonderful. They're everything to me, but they do require maintenance. But the maintenance depends on what plant species you select. So for example, if you choose to pick mostly trees, small trees and shrubs initially, and you select those plants appropriately and space them out appropriately based on their mature size, you're likely going to have very little maintenance besides the establishment of those trees in the long run. But if you want to vary it with many different plant habits that include the herbaceous forbs and the grasses, etc., that will entail more maintenance. But when you're thinking about bird-friendly landscaping maintenance, as well as for the native insects, try to leave your leaves. If you have leaves, try to bring them into your bed and provide that organic compost. The leaf litter, long grasses, and brush piles, they're vital for the insects where they hide and harbor and where they overwinter to survive, which is ultimately necessary for bird survival as well. Where you can, try to think about leaving the plants standing throughout the entire year. Migrant birds and winter resident birds, they rely heavily on seeds of our native perennials. And regarding pruning, especially with the shrubs and trees and hedgerows, try to decrease the amount of pruning, other than maybe to increase fruit. Those plants are growing and providing bird habitat. And you really want to especially avoid it during spring and summer when the birds are nesting. And I want to very quickly go into, last but not least, the wonderful and fascinating world of insects. I'm not an entomologist, and I am a lifelong learner of gardening and native plants and birds and insects, but I do find these fascinating. David Attenborough said, these small creatures are within a few inches of our feet, wherever we go on land, but often they're disregarded. We would do very well to remember them. And in their field of Guide to Insects in North America, they made a comment on the actual insect that I'm showing here, a beneficial insect, which is a great black wasp, a solitary wasp. And they said that the solitary wasps are, quote, perhaps the most undervalued insects. Many are gentle and colorful. I am delighted when I see this. This was taken in my home yard landscape. When I see these, they do not sting me. They might sting if you're near their tunnel, but they are in general gentle and colorful and fascinating to watch. And it was interesting because John Bartram, when he was doing his travels in 1700s here, he presented to the Royal Society in London in 1749 about this particular insect, the great black wasp. And it was the first accepted account of a New World insect that was authored by a New World scientist. You never know how fascinating they are and the history behind them. So there are bad bugs. These are the guys that, they're consuming our plants, they bite our flesh, they feed on our pets, our dogs, and they just cause havoc, like medically, economically, aesthetically. But like 99% of the insects out there in our world are either beneficial or benign. And these insects, they're providing us pest control, they're providing pollination and food for wildlife. And so what we want to concentrate now on centering on the particular beneficial insects to provide that natural pest control so that we can minimize or eliminate chemical use in our landscapes. And by reducing those chemicals, we're protecting the pollinators, those beneficial insects, the birds and other wildlife. And as we mentioned before, just as a reminder, all these insects are important protein sources for those nesting songbirds. So here they are. Here are your most wanted beneficial insects, and you want to see these in your landscape. Okay, to the left, we have the pollinators, which I adore, I love, but that is not part of the discussion today. The other two beneficial insects are predators and parasitoids. And these are ones that you want to find in your diversified landscape. The predators, or natural enemies, they actually directly consume the pest insects for food. And perhaps you've seen some of these little visitors in your landscape. We also have the parasites. They actually have the adult insects that inject their eggs into these host species. And ultimately, when the larvae rear, they feed on the pests, such as this hornworm caterpillar, for their survival and growth. And so when you're supporting beneficial insects, you're being preventive relative to chemical use. You're being proactive in your approach to pest management. So by increasing biodiversity in our landscapes with many of the plants that they like and creating the habitat for them, we will boost those beneficial species that are going to provide that pest control, and while reducing our reliance on those chemicals. And by doing that, we'll keep our landscapes healthy. So here's an example on the top of 3 larvae you want to see in your landscape. Look at them, they're ravishing these aphids and other pests. And below them are their adult counterparts, the beneficial insects as well. And this just gives you an example of some of the native flowers and herbs. These are basically, in general, the plants that have small flower compositions. Their nectaries are easy to get to by those beneficial insects. And they really help to draw in the largest diversity of those beneficials. And this is a rough mantra for people to understand, but when nature's in balance in your landscape, you're going to find a mixture of good and bad insects in your garden. It's an up and down. It really is an up and down, the way this works throughout the growing season. But you need the bad insects in there first to attract and draw the good insects. It's sometimes hard for people to take. I see people taking a big breath and swallowing. Just hang in there. So I felt I had to bring this up. I know we're talking about how to reduce chemical use by having the beneficials in our landscape. So felt it was necessary to say, well, okay, you're drawing in these pollinators, you're drawing in these beneficials, you want to draw on these birds. So of course, you don't want to use pesticides. You know, there's more and more pests that are getting much more resistant to pesticide use. And they removing the beneficials, the food that's attracting the beneficials, and when they're exposed indirectly or directly, it can wreak havoc with the life that's being sustained within your landscape and adjacent to it. Another issue is you don't want to use what we call synthetic insecticides, a class of neonicotinoids. They are systemic and they will work throughout every single tissue of a plant up through the pollen and the nectar with treatment. And they are highly toxic to insects, and they pose a real source for pollinators and beneficial insects for potentially quite a few months or years after actual treatment, as you saw with the bumblebee kill off. You want to make sure you provide shelter for these beneficials as well, protection from the elements, predators, especially overwintering is very important, so you secure them while they're dormant. And you want to consider also the advantage of supporting these other beneficial animals that hopefully you'll be seeing in your landscape. Many of arachnids are not insects, they're closely related, and many of the beneficial spiders actually do not actually have webs, but then you have spiders such as these orb spiders, and their actual silk is utilized by hummingbirds to build their nests. So do you see all that interconnection and interdependency of all these living animals? So very, very quickly, I'm going to just quickly go slide by slide. And the idea is just to provide you an idea of some of the bird-friendly native plants for coastal Georgia landscapes. It's really true that if you plant these plants, they are going to come. It's just really thrilling because I haven't had anyone tell me otherwise. It's something that's a gift that we can give ourselves. So in this first slide, which covers trees and shrubs, you will see at the top, some of these species will have this notation. And I specifically put these there to let you know that they were referred by Audubon. Many other books and resources also have suggested and promote these, especially all of these plants that I have in these slides. But I just wanted you to know that when you do see that little white bird at the top, that indicates it's an Audubon selective. So just look at the diversity of some showing the flowering components, some showing the fruiting components of the species, the diversity, the beauty that we have here in coastal Georgia. I mean, we are just really blessed. Here are some of the fruiting trees that I feel my birds, my Prunus umbellata it's a little small tree, and I can often see 20 to 30 songbirds in that tree at a time. Just a delight. And you want to consider evergreens and conifers. If you have a large landscape, you can look at some of these larger trees. Hollies are huge, so I provided several different species for them, and actually different hollies may fruit at different times. Of course, the southern red cedar, that's very important. And maybe perhaps you see the cedar waxwings that feed so voracious on them in the fall and winter. And please do not forget about native grasses. They not only provide shelter for birds or nesting material for birds, but they also provide food sources of insects. And many of these grasses you see are actually host plants for pollinator species. And we are blessed with beautiful native grasses. And then the vines. You typically think of, for instance, the trumpet vine or the coral honeysuckle that really draws in the hummingbirds. But we do have other birds as well that will feed on vines, such as what you'll see, the Virginia creeper. It's in the winter and the fall that provides a wonderful food source for other songbirds. And here's some other vines, muscadines. Here's a smilax. Any smilax is good, and it might not be something you want to keep in your landscape, but this particular smilax does not have any thorns in it and is very preferred by the birds. And then here's just an example of the native forbs and herbs. So many of our forbs provide wonderful seeds through the winter, fall and winter for the birds. But many of these also are very important to support the insects that they rely on. And look at the colors and look at the variety. And I do want to point out this one, on the lower right, Biden's alba. People do not like to think about Biden's alba a lot. It's a beggar tick, but it is considered one of the most important pollinator species here in this area and elsewhere. And birds depend on it very much as well. In fact, I see my painted bunnings often feeding on the seeds of these. Look at the beautiful color and the textures and the difference in the compositions of all these plants. Gorgeous.
Keren, while we're still on these slides, we did have a question from some folks wondering what forbs are.
Oh, I'm sorry. When I'm talking about forbs and herbs, I'm talking that non-woody native plants. Okay, so you're thinking about the flowering plants that will die back typically most of the time throughout the season. We do have a couple of vines that may be more on the woody side, but they are not the trees and they are not the shrubs and they are not the grasses. So it's more typically the plants that you consider putting in a garden, a wildflower garden, for example. I hope some of these look familiar to people. Also up to the upper left, pokeweed. Oh boy, I know some people see that not as a favored plant, but if you have a little bit of wildness in your landscape, they are truly loved by so many different birds. And here's a picture of just a young juvenile bluebird feeding on them. They are utilized by many different species of birds. And look at those colors. Look at the gorgeous colors that we have to choose from. So I know I'm getting near the end, but I just want to say something. Rachel Carson, she has really been my heroine in life and how I proceeded in my life. She was really a beacon to me. And what she said, I feel, is very prevalent right now. She said, "Those who dwell among the beauty and mysteries of the earth are never alone or weary of life. Whatever the vexations or concerns of their personal lives, their thoughts can find paths that lead to inner contentment and to renewed excitement in living. Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts." Any questions? And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Keren. What an inspiring presentation. We had a number of questions. we did have a question about, is there a bird-friendly way to keep birds from eating all of our Meyer lemon buds? After the buds are formed, they are gone the next day, hence no Meyer lemons from our trees.
Oh, huh. I would have to actually look into that more. Does that person know what birds they are? Because it sounds like it might tend to be birds that nest in or feed in aggregates, or is it individual birds? I'm not as familiar with what to do for lemons. You might want to consider planting another one so you have more options, but that might draw them on. I'm really sorry. I don't really know how to tell you to do that, because I'm concerned about, I know people use netting and things like that, and that can be very dangerous for the birds. So I might have to look into that. Kayla, if you know the person, if they can provide their email, I'll be happy to look into that further for them.
Sounds good. We can definitely do that. We had another question about eating plants. What about the deer eating plants? Any advice on that?
Yeah, being a wildlife biologist, that's a hard one. As you might notice, I don't have a deer resistant plant list, native plant list. It really depends based on where you're at, the quality of the natural food they have, the quality and health of the herd itself, etc. So are these people on perhaps one of the barrier islands? It might be a little bit trickier. There are a few native plants that tend to be pretty resistant, but I know many I see on resistant lists, I hear from people, are being utilized. So again, that person might, if they tell me where they're at, I might be able to provide them a few plants that I truly, just based on experience and word of mouth, may provide some help. It really comes down to perhaps management of the herd and things like that as well.
Thanks, Karen. There was another question about, are there any efforts we can support to get rid of neonicotinoids? And when you answer, if you could also, just in case there's other folks that aren't sure what that means, describe what neonicotinoids are. Okay.
Neonicotinoids came in 1993, was passed through US EPA after organophosphates or carbamates were eliminated and removed for use due to their toxicity. And now neonicotinoids are the #1 insecticides used throughout the world. So it's very prevalent. The first thing you can do is do not buy and use any of these class type insecticides of neonicotinoids. I have a wonderful flyer that was made by Xerces Society that I'd be happy to, I'll note that, I'll be happy to provide to Kayla, to provide you a lot of different things that you can do. But first and foremost, do not use the chemical. And just so you know, if you have lawn care use, neonicotinoid use is labeled for higher concentrations on lawn care than in actual agricultural crops. If you have lawn care use, you want to ask them if they're using it. That brochure that I will share will give you a list of the different brand names and different types of neonicotinoids. So that's another thing for personally. Thirdly, you want to ask, when you go to a nursery, you want to ask them, have you sprayed this plant I'm thinking about buying with neonicotinoids? If they say yes, put it down. Okay, do not buy from them, and let them know why you're choosing not to buy from them. Because as I mentioned, it can be very long term. It can be up to 3 years of up to exposure, depending on the plant, the way it was applied, and how often it was applied. So it is not something you want to be exposed to or your loved ones be exposed to. It is not highly toxic to mammals, and that's one of the reasons why it was passed readily. It's highly toxic to the insects that all these other animals we talked about, birds, depend on. So those are some of the key things I do. You can also support organizations that are fighting to have these chemicals removed for registration for use. So that's another key thing. But I think as a consumer, don't buy it. don't buy plants that have it in them, and let it be known that you care, that you don't want it on your lawn, that you don't want it on your any plants, that you don't want it in the ecosystems.
Well, thank you, Karen, for all of that information. And I know there's some more questions in the chat about winter blooming flowers and local nurseries, but we are out of time. So I will try and capture those and we'll send a follow-up email. But if you do have additional questions, you can also email Karen directly, and all of our information is on the on our website. And we do have a few more upcoming events. This webinar counts as hours towards the Coastal Stewards Program. And our next one that'll count towards the Coastal Stewards Program is coming up in February about diamondback terrapin conservation. And then in March, the rain garden workshop that Karen mentioned. So those are all events for adults that are designed to provide some information about environmental stewardship related issues and solutions. We do have one on Saturday that is more for 4th to 7th grade students with an accompanying adult. So if you're interested, you can find all of that on our webpage. But I do want to let you all go in case your lunch break is coming to an end. Oh, Karen has one more thing to say.
Just very quick, send me all the questions so that I could try to answer them, and that can be sent with the other information, of course. I'm sorry about that. I spoke too long, I think. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. That was awesome information. And thank you all so much for spending your lunch with us, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
See you later.
You all. Good luck. Be good stewards. I know you all are. Wish you the best.